this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be my attempt to try to explain the differences between the way somebody on the left and right think. So my family is actually kind of an interesting case. My family is composed of teachers and doctors. It's kind of strange. Like either choose one of those two paths in my family. We're not very creative in terms of the jobs that we do. And the teachers are generally very left-wing in my family, and the ones who are the doctors are very science-oriented and very rational and very right-wing, kind of conservative way of thinking. So it's very interesting. So whenever we have a family get-together, the two sides meet, and it's like water and oil. They just don't mix, and they don't understand each other. And it's really actually hard to understand the other side because they just don't think the same way. And it's really interesting because I've noticed the way, like I'm more of the conservative, logical side, whereas I find the people on the left generally think very emotionally. And it's almost like the way difference between men and women. Those on the left adopt more of a female perspective, what's known as like a female perspective, very nurturing, very caring, not necessarily rational, whereas those on the right are more conservative viewpoint, which is more rational thinking, more like strict rules, but rules that allow for creativity and allow for progress. So there's the two different mindsets. Now, I remember having a conversation with my aunt, and I thought it was like sort of an obvious thing. Like I was talking about the healthcare system in Canada and how it's, really, this was actually like 20 years ago that I had this conversation. And I was talking about how bad it was, like how slow it was, how, even to get like a simple surgery takes months. And when you're waiting for that simple surgery, you could actually, increase the damage you're doing to your body because you're just not healthy while you're waiting. And that was 20 years ago. It's much worse now. And the part of the problem was at the time, and still to this day, the Canadian healthcare system is fundamentally one choice. There is no private system. It's just public system. And you cannot use private care. So you don't have that choice. You don't have the freedom to go wherever you want to get whatever surgery or health care that you need. So often what ends up happening is the public system gets overwhelmed by just the sheer demand. So I was talking to my aunt at the time, this 20 years ago, and I said, hey, we really should have like an option, just like, private option if we want. Like if we're willing to spend the money, why not have a private option, like where we can just, it's our money, we can just go and spend it if we want. And the public option can still be there. And, that would be good because at the time, actually, the reason I even said this was I had just had the same experience where I got injured and I needed a surgery because I couldn't walk if I didn't get the surgery. So I waited I think it was like 4 to 5 months to get the surgery. And, it was just, I thought it was would have been nice if I could have just gotten surgery that day, instead of having to wait. And it was a simple surgery. But the system didn't allow it, and you have to wait. So I just said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had this second option? And her response, she was like almost confused by it. Why wouldn't you want purely a public option? And she said, oh, the government should just spend more money on it. And it's unfair to have a private option because what's going to happen is all the good doctors will go to that private system because they can make more money. And she said that would gradually weaken the public system. And, she saw it as like this just horrible idea. And it was a very emotional response. And I could see that she was even getting angry about it when I even suggested the idea that maybe we should just have a second option. And so it was very emotional. Whereas I was just being rational. I was just saying like, hey, this is the this is the logical reason for why you should have two options at least. And it's that emotional way of thinking that really is at the heart of the way people on the left think. They think of the idea of people needing to be cared for. They might not want care for themselves. It's not like the people on the left are selfish. Like that's a lot of people on the right think, oh, these people on the left, they just want free stuff. It's not that case. Often the people on the left want free stuff for other people. They want to make sure that everybody's protected. It's nurturing kind of philosophy. It's very caring philosophy. They feel like the only way to take care of these poor people is to have the government come in and provide the things that they need. And if if people have to pay more taxes, that's fine, as long as all the people are taken care of. So it's a very motherly, nurturing way of thinking. Whereas people on the right, often you hear, oh, the people on the right are heartless. They're so mean. Why don't they care about people? But they do. It just in a different way. It's sort of like the idea is that people on the right, when they think about this kind of situation, well, they think these people who are poor or in some kind of traumatic situation, they can take care of themselves. They can if they're given the opportunity, they can find their own solutions to resolve their problems. And often people on the right think, well, the government is terrible, often the worst at actually resolving people's problems. I just know so many circumstances where the situation has been where the government comes in, you know that things are going to get worse. If the people just, if you just take that money that's being used by the government and just let people keep it, not be taxed to death, often the people can use that money in a much more productive way. It's sort of like the idea that if you believe in charity and giving money to whatever organization, you want to give it to the organizations that are good. And what you'll generally do is you'll kind of look into those organizations. You'll vet them, make sure that they're putting real, they're not just hiding the money or stealing the money. They're doing something with the money that's good and it achieves the goal that you're looking for. So, for example, I give money to a child in India. And, we get like the photos, we get the monthly things about that child. And, it helps that child, get an education, do better in life. Okay. And that's my money. I get to decide how it's being used. However, what happens with the government is you basically give the money to the government and they randomly choose who they're going to give it to. And they don't necessarily give it to the people you would have recommended, and it's not necessarily vetted in the way it should be in terms of, is the money being used properly? And often it's just wasted. So it's like, wow, if I had that dollar, I'd rather make sure that it goes directly to the person that's going to benefit from it than give it to the government, and maybe 10 cents of that dollar will get to the person that I really wanted it to go to. And that's generally the way the people on the right think. They think, if I'm going to do charity, I'm going to do it in a very efficient way, very logical way, where it goes directly to the source of the problem. Whereas the government way or left-wing way is to think that the government knows best and it can make those decisions for you. Now, those are two very different philosophies, and it's really hard to bridge the gap between them. I almost think of it based, just going back to my own family. on the difference between teachers and doctors. And the difference between teachers and doctors is a doctor is, they're both part of the in Canada especially, they're both part of the system. And one is a teacher that works for the government, and basically, they get paid by the government. And the other is a doctor who also gets paid by the government. And what happens is they go through different paths. So a teacher generally goes through arts program, and they generally have sort of an arts background. That could be literature. They'll have some science. They'll have more of a arts background in university, whereas a doctor will have more of that scientific background, where they'll have pure sciences, and then they'll go on to medical school, and they'll have a very analytical way of thinking. Well, the arts, they teach you about creativity. They teach you about beauty and all aesthetics, and they teach you about more of that sort of way of thinking in terms of creativity, which is good. It has its uses, but it doesn't teach you that analytical thought that you see in the sciences. If you read a scientific paper versus a literature paper, you can see the difference. Scientific paper you never refer to yourself. It's always it's almost like there's no person involved. It's like statements of fact, statement of process. It's very analytical in the way it presents itself. Whereas if you read literature paper, it's very colorful language, and they'll use really complicated ways of saying something in order to create some kind of imagination within the words that are being used. And both have their uses. So, but the way you think is very different to achieve those two effects. And it's really that way of thinking that defines the difference between left and right. The people that are right, as I said, are just more analytical. They think of risk. They're much more risk adverse. They think of they're more independent thinkers as well. They're more willing to take on a challenge themselves than have somebody do that challenge for them. They want to be more in control. Whereas people on the left generally have the opposite kind of thinking. They are more communal. They're not as individualistic. They believe that as I said, the nurturing kind of component. They are more risk embracing. They'll take risks, and as a result, they can be very successful because they do take those risks. They're not calculated risks, but they do take risks that can be major benefit. So a lot of the creativity comes from the left, and it's a good thing. As I said, these are two different mindsets. It's sort of like a family. As I said, people on the left are kind of like the female, and people on the right are kind of like the masculine side. So what happens is when those two sources come together, like father and mother, you get a good parent situation for the child. And the child is well-rounded because they have that nurturing, supportive environment, but also they have the rules and the strict thought, and they can think in a way that's forward thinking and risk adverse. So you get balance of risk taking plus risk adverse, and you get somewhere in the middle where you get sort of a well-rounded child that can say, okay, that's risky and I might do it, but here's the potential downfall of my actions. And they get that kind of person. Whereas if you have just one parent involved, you'll get a very distorted child where that's what's happening with the West right now. You get a lot of single mother households, And as a result, the children are just totally messed up. They're very they haven't gotten that push that the father would bring to them to stand on their own 2 feet, to make rational decisions, and to have like a sense of discipline. And they're very dependent on their parents, on their mother, I should say. And it's sort of like the feminization of our society. But what's happened is more and more people have moved to the left, because as more and more women are single mothers, it really doesn't provide that double-sided or complete picture to the child, and they as a result aren't well-rounded. And the stats behind single motherhood and the effects on the child they're pretty substantial. Increased criminality and all these kind of social problems. Less likely to finish school. It's not a good thing. So what I'm trying to get at is there's these two philosophies, and both have their good points, but you can't have one or the other. You have to have both, and they have to work together. So right now, what we have in our society is a bipolar society, where it's either one or the other, and there's no in between. Well, really, what we need is not one or the other. We need both. We need both working together. And this is why the demonization of one side or the other is not beneficial to our society. In fact, what we should be doing is looking at ways to bridge the gap and have the two sides work together. But that doesn't seem so likely right now. And the thing is, what happens, and the problem that we have in our society right now, is that people don't have a sense of how to work together. They're so stuck in their own philosophies that they're not willing to make that leap to the other side and try to understand what they're thinking. And what we really need is the two sides working together, because it creates a well-rounded solution in the end. I generally think from the analytical side. I generally think from the conservative side, and I think there's lots of benefits to that. But I do see the benefits from the other side, and I'm willing to accept some of what they say. But I would like to have the opportunity to guide them so that they can see a more full picture. Because often, a lot of the time, like, I think, gee, their heart is really in the right place. But why are they so brain dead? That's the way I think. I know that sounds insulting, but and they probably say, oh, why is that guy, he's like, so like, maybe his head is in the right place, but he has no heart. And generally that's the kind of way that people think when they look across the aisle and see the other side. And maybe there is some truth in that. But the point is, like, if you just constantly demonize the other side, you'll never see the benefits of the other side. And I really do see that there's benefits to both sides. So the goal of this video, and my goal, is I recommend reach out to the other side and be open-minded. This is a funny thing. Like, the funny thing is, I described the two sides, and I kind of want to make this point really clear. The left and right, you would think the left would be much more open-minded, because they're always progressive. They're very future thinking. They kind of want, freedom for all these kind of, things, and they want equality. Whereas the right maybe understands that people are different and equality is kind of a lie. Whereas people on the left really want that kind of equality, equity, all these kind of terms that come from the left. And generally, you'd think that kind of way of thinking would be very open-minded. However, that's generally not the case. It's kind of weird. Generally, what happens is people on the left have a tendency of being very conformist, which is weird because, the artsy-fartsy, think they're more, socially, like, all over the place, like not so controlled and confined. But what ends up happening is you'll notice that they're very collectivist in the way that they think. That they can't handle the thoughts of others. They get very emotional, just like my aunt did when I had that conversation with her. They get very emotional when somebody thinks differently than they do, because they take it as a personal attack, and they take it as an attack against their society and their collective view. And that's really the danger of the left, that they have this collectivist view, and anything that goes against it has to be destroyed, and that it's evil. Actually, they'll actually use that kind of language. They'll demonize it, like it's like Hitler or whatever. They like to find their demons. The point is they're very emotional. So if anything goes against that way of thinking, then generally what'll happen is they will try to squish it. They'll crush it. So if you notice, like socialist societies are very against free speech. They're very controlling societies, and they want people all to think in the same way. Whereas people on the right are much more open-minded, strangely. You'd think the conservative, like just the sheer word conservative, you think, well, they're very rigid. They don't have, they want everyone to be thinking the same way as they do, and they would be very closed-minded. But actually the opposite is true. Generally people on the right have a tendency of more being individualistic and more about freedom and being open to ideas. They might not disagree, they might not agree with those ideas, but they're willing to consider those ideas. If you look at the scientific method, it's actually kind of shows this very, very clearly. The scientific method, and one of my favorite stories actually about it, was there was this physicist, and he had done like years, I mean literally years of study in one particular thing, and he came up with this theory that was very like well understood. It made sense, and he was doing a speech about it, and people said, "Oh, this is really great," and it seemed to be a very good explanation for how things worked, and there was a lot of logic behind it. However, one of the people in the audience came up and said, "Hey, look, there is a flaw in your logic. And here's the flaw. And if you look at it this way, you will see that your theory falls apart." So the guy, you would think, okay, if he was on the left, he'd be like, "Oh, shut up. I don't want to even hear you." But because he was a scientist, he was on the right, he was conservative. The way he thought was this: "Oh my goodness, I never saw this. I never thought about this point." And instead of putting him down, he congratulated him. He applauded the guy that destroyed his own theory. He was like, he embraced him and said, "Wow, I am so happy that you have shown me this." Because, and his whole way of thinking changed immediately. He was open to the idea of being refuted. And the scientific method, they talk about that all the time, that it's about refuting ideas, falsibility, like that you constantly challenge the scientific consensus, and that you constantly challenge the way that the ideas, like make sure that they work by constantly challenging them. And if you, by challenging them, you constantly improve them, because like things get missed, and you just constantly challenge it until it's a better and better idea. So that's the way the scientific method works. Most people don't understand that it's a constant improvement, even though it's being constantly challenged and changed. It's unlike the climate scientists. Climate science is a good example of this, where I'd say it's a very left-leaning science, because what happens with climate science is they talk about consensus. Well, in science, there is no consensus. Science doesn't work by consensus. It works by having a theory, proving that it works, looking at it factually, getting results that that show a certain idea. The way you describe your findings or the result is based on what the actual facts say. You don't change the facts to meet your own theory. It's the other way around. So on the left, like with climate science, they say, well, global warming is, and they create basically facts that meet their theory. Instead, what it should be is that you say, well, is there global warming? And then you look at the data, and if the data shows that there's global warming, you say, well, based on the data, there's this trend of warming. And if the data doesn't show that, you say, well, no, there is no global warming. And generally, actually, the data is kind of mixed on it. So, there's these theories that are on the left and right. And generally, for science, it's best to have that sort of analytical right-wing way of thinking. And, it's good that there's people on the left that help come up with ideas and add the creativity to the mix. But then you need the rigor to basically go through and make sure that it actually holds water when you actually test those ideas. So that's how the two work together. And it's really important to have that. And it frustrates me as both somebody that comes from this family of left and right, and I chose to be a business person. So I didn't follow the two paths that were open to me and my family. I didn't choose to be a doctor. I didn't choose to be a teacher, though I did try to be a doctor, and I did work as a teacher for 3 years. So, so maybe I did both, but then ended up as a business person. So it's kind of funny that I didn't go that route, but I see both sides, and I just want the dialogue to happen again. A dialogue is really two people, and that's important. It's both sides, and it's really important that we get both sides talking to each other. The left-wing people really need to kind of open up to the idea of different ideas, and the right people on the right have to stop thinking that the people on the left are just idiots that don't know any better. So there's a bit of both that has to, there has to be some way that these two sides can start working together again. And whenever you see anything nowadays, think about it from both sides if you can. Always try to think both sides, because that way you'll have a much more rounded opinion about that. And just question when they show something on the news or whatever. What way is it coming across? Is it an emotional argument that they're presenting, or is it an analytical argument they're presenting? And once you start looking at it in those terms, is it emotional that they're saying, or is it analytical? So like when I watch the news, especially CBC News, which is the Canadian broadcasting station, it is the worst. It is all pure emotional stuff. And you kind of want there to be some factual stuff behind the news that they provide, but there isn't. Often it's just emotional story after emotional story. And even like things that should be factual are seen or described in an emotional way. And it's just really frustrating to watch these kind of videos from like the mainstream media, and you just hear one emotional argument after another. And what I try to do is I try to bring in my analytical mind, and I think about it in a way that is different, that is unique. Like I try to think, what would be the facts behind this? What is the analytical argument for what they're saying? And that gives me a rounded picture. And then I can actually fact check a lot of the stuff that they say. And when I start doing that, I kind of peel back the story and get the truth, which is often lacking nowadays. It's hard to get that like true story. Just one more anecdotal story. I actually saw this really, really interesting speech by Trump. Now, if you say Trump to somebody on the left, just you saying that, it's like they freak out. They get this emotional response, and they just, it's like, it's visceral. It's like, it's they get really angry. It's like you can see their blood boiling. It's amazing. If you just want to piss off people on the left, you just say the word Trump and then they go into a rage. It's kind of funny. So it was an interesting thing because he said something very, very simple, and I forget what it was actually, and he was talking to a reporter, and as an analytical person, I understood he didn't say anything major. He was just like something, and I just understood it as that something. Now I watched the same report about that one statement that he made on CNN and Fox. Now, Fox interpreted it the way I did, that he meant like just this factual thing. Whereas people on the left, when they saw that same set of words, they interpreted it as this emotional thing, and it had a very negative meaning. Where I was like, well, how did they get that? That the two people observing the same phrase got two very different reactions from it. And it's partly biased, of course, like CNN's very biased against Trump, but also I believe it's those two minds, that there is the mind of the left, and the way they interpret things is very different than the way that the people on the right interpret things. And it's kind of crazy to see this, but it is real that there's a different way of thinking. And it's one of those things that we really have to figure out is, how do the people on the right think, but how do the people on the left think? And once you kind of understand the way that those two minds work, then you can maybe bridge the gap between them. So this has been a little bit of a rant. I hope you enjoyed this video regardless of my ranting. Please check out my other videos, and please share my videos. I did a video really early on in my channel's history where I did this video about some Black activists, and ever since I've been basically shadow banned by YouTube. So if you could promote me by just telling other people to watch my content if you enjoy it, please do so. You can't even find my channel when you search it. It's like so annoying. So it's just do what you can to help this channel out by sharing this content. And please check out my other videos. I love talking about different political things and and the reason for the name is socially triggered. It's because it's like these social issues that trigger me, make me, what's going on here? Why are they thinking this way? And I want to address a lot of the stuff that's happening in our society and kind of bring those ideas to light and have people discuss it. So that was the real philosophy behind this channel. And it was my way to sort of vent my frustration with a lot of the stuff that's happening in the mainstream media. So I hope you enjoy these videos. Please check out my other stuff again. And thanks for listening. Bye.